Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld podcast. Today is July 22nd. It is Monday, 2019, and tonight's topic: China exports its road to nowhere economy overseas. For years, we've been hearing the gold pumpers talking about the prodigious gains of China and how China is going to crush the dollar and the yuan is going to become the international reserve currency. It's going to be end of dollar hegemony, China to crush the dollar, dollar collapse, multipolar world. And then we hear China is productive and the United States does nothing but borrow money, print up little green pieces of paper, and send them to China while China is just producing like mad, while the United States is just a lazy country that is debt-ridden. And to add to all this, China loves gold, and they're buying gold hand over fist. And they have so much gold, but they don't tell people how much they have it because Sun Tzu says, or some other nonsense. And they're building infrastructure. And this is basically heaven on earth, according to some of the gold pumpers, that China is basically the country of the future. And it loves gold, and the United States loves debt. And again, that's only part of the story. We've discussed for years on this channel how the Chinese economy is one big debt Ponzi scheme, creating more debt than the United States and all other countries combined the last 10 years, and downplaying their supposed prowess in building infrastructure. Because we viewed building that infrastructure, if there's no market demand for it, is essentially no different than digging ditches and then filling them back up again and assigning that to government workers and paying them for that. It's just a more elaborate ruse. Is the government decides that, well, we need to create some GDP, we need to have some jobs, we need some banking activity, we want money to be lent, we want our state-owned enterprises to build stuff, and we want to, well, real estate's probably the best place to do it because we can build skyscrapers, we can build tunnels, bridges, railroads, and all types of infrastructure, and we can create economic growth. And then, of course, if those infrastructure projects or apartment buildings do not yield any revenue, and there's no reason they would expect there to be any revenue if there's no market need for them, well, then the banks are on the hook. Well, no, they're not, because the banks will be told by the People's Bank of China to extend the loans to create more credit, to extend the projects, ignore the loans, or even just convert them into equity or extend them outright for in perpetuity. And the China apologists keep insisting that this is okay, this is a good thing. When the world goes, when the SHF, I can't even do the anachronism, when the blank hits the fan, they're going to be in great shape because they will at least have all this infrastructure ready, willing, and able to go, not realizing that in an entire worldwide debt collapse, the last thing you want is a lot of infrastructure, rotting buildings, bridges to nowhere that require maintenance or of no value. When you have reduced economic activity, you're not going to grow into all that infrastructure that you were unable to grow into prior to any type of debt collapse. Well, in any event, we hear these stories all the time, and then we hear the China apologists, and a lot of them are gold pumpers, that China has more of a free market, they're more capitalist than the United States, which is complete nonsense. Capitalism is not about the state dictating where capital is going to flow, who's going to lend money to whom, what projects are going to be built, how they're going to be accounted for. The allocation of capital in a capitalist market is never done by a centrally planned government, and certainly in a capitalist economy, any type of overspending, misallocation of resources, malinvestment is the word they like to use, gets liquidated. Well, in China, it doesn't. They just keep increasing it, and the Chinese government is aware that they've done this. Now, the other issue that they talk about, they say, well, when I've pointed out that China also has far more debt than the United States, the obvious response, well, it's not obvious response, it's just the response that they like to use, comes back that, well, they owe it to themselves. It's not like they're relying on foreign borrowing, which is, I'm sorry, that's an ignorant response because internal debt still has to be paid. Well, what makes China's internal debt insidious is that it is denominated for the most part in US dollars. So in a sense, they are reliant on foreigners. They're reliant on coming up with the dollars, the Benjamins, to pay for all that debt. So it's not like they've just created this bubble inside themselves where they're lending money to themselves and everything's going to be fine. And by the way, that is not fine, because all you have to do is look to the United States. One of the criticisms of the United States is not just the $20 trillion deficit that the U.S. has, some of it owed by that we owe to foreigners, the United States owes to foreigners, but it's the hundreds of millions of dollars of what they call unfunded liabilities. Well, unfunded liabilities are essentially just money the United States owes to itself. Social Security, Medicaid. So while the gold pumpers and the Chinese apologists like to say it's no big deal, China just owes money to itself, they don't give the U.S. the same pass for the unfunded liabilities that the U.S. has. After all, that's just money the U.S. owes to itself. They can print that up. Debt is debt, and debt will be insidious no matter what. And I'm not suggesting that the United States debt position is tenable, but we hear this gold pumper argument that somehow China good, America bad, Sun Tzu, all this type of nonsense. And it's all based on trying to sell you gold, because China likes gold and China is smart and China reads Sun Tzu and they know what's going on. And this belies the fact that they don't even look or having mentioned China's social policies, their surveillance state, the social credit scores. All of these things that China does are overlooked in the name of gold. Gold, and this all reached its peak, this Chinese gold adoration, or this admiration of China because of gold, about 2 years ago, with the issuance of that story, the gold-backed yuan game changer. Remember that one? That was where China was going to back their yuan with gold, and then it was going to be game over, because then the petro yuan, they were going to force Saudi Arabia to use the yuan, and if they didn't want the yuan when they traded their oil for it, they could just walk it right over to the Shanghai Gold Exchange and get gold for it. Complete nonsense. I called that story out 2 years ago. I said, first of all, it doesn't make any sense that they would do that. Second of all, Saudi Arabia is not going to go for it. And it turned out to be a totally false story. China was never going to back its yuan with gold. The rules in China are you can't take the gold out of the country. They weren't going to allow their gold reserves to be drained just so they can use the yuan. And now I'm asking, whatever happened to the gold pumper, gold back yuan, China to crush the dollar meme? Is Chinese cheerleading out of vogue? Well, I guess so. I mean, the gold price is moving up now, so they can start focusing on other stories. But the latest in all of this now, which I think it's kind of hard, it's somewhat an untenable argument to be still pumping gold back yuan game changers and China to crush the dollar and multipolar world and China's yuan to become the world reserve currency, when over the last 6 years the percentage of yuan held as reserves by central banks has essentially stayed under 2%. So the Chinese yuan is not becoming a world reserve currency for many reasons. First of all, they have capital controls. We know China will always put their domestic economy first. So you cannot have a reserve currency with those types of capital controls. They have massive amounts of debt. They have so little transparency into what's going on in the country financially. So it is not a desired reserve asset, despite all this, well, they've got all this gold. Well, again, those are generalities. Well, Sun Tzu, you don't know how much they owe. Okay. I did a thing on this, maybe this was 2 years ago, but this gives you some indication of the idea of China's gold. And that story is another one where the People's Bank of China says they have X amount of gold, and then all the gold pumpers come out and say they're lying, they have more gold than they say, Sun Tzu. Well, first of all, if you believe that the Chinese yuan should be a world reserve currency, you can't believe that there's some kind of genius strategist for Sun Tzu and deception. Because a Sun Tzu deception will never give you a world reserve currency. In order to have a world reserve currency, you have to have transparency. Putting that aside, even if, this is back from 2017, a year ago, I pointed out that China's gold isn't going to save it from its debt collapse. At the time, I think their debt was listed at about 28 trillion. It's probably about 60, 70 trillion right now. And the value of their gold right now is under $1 trillion. Now, when I say their gold, I'm including not just the People's Bank of China's gold, but all gold that could conceivably be inside the country, based on Hong Kong imports that we've seen over the last 15 years, Chinese mining production, Shanghai imports, and what the People's Bank of China say they have. So people say they have 20, 30,000 tons. Well, 20, 30,000 tons isn't a lot of money in dollars. 20,000 tons is worth about $1 trillion. Now, let's say you raise the value of the price of gold to $4,000. It's still only $2.5 trillion, $3 trillion. Raise it to $10,000. It's $6 trillion. Now, first of all, no one's saying that we're going to move the price of gold up to 10 grand, 20 grand. But even if we did, it's not going to cover the massive debt Ponzi scheme that China has. So put that aside. People keep saying, oh, China's got infrastructure and they have gold and they have Sun Tzu. None of those are going to save them. Sun Tzu's probably their best shot. The amount of gold they have in the country isn't going to save them. All right. But and the other one is, well, they're dumping treasuries. They're dumping treasuries. No, they're not really dumping treasuries, and I'm going to show you. They talk in these generalities about dumping treasuries. I've been following this for about 6-7 years. They've had about between 1.1 and 1.3, 1.4 trillion dollars in U.S. treasuries over the past 6 years. The chart you're looking at here is from the tick report from the U.S. Treasury, and it shows them at $1.11 trillion in May, the most recent reading, down slightly from 1.13. If you go a year ago into 2018, they had 1.183. So they're down about $70 billion. It's an insignificant amount. These amounts go up, they go down. But of course, the gold pumper, end of dollar hegemony, dollar collapse, China to crush the dollar. When anytime China sells a few $billion worth of treasuries, it's game over and game change. Aren't they dumping their treasuries? Hear this all the time. And they're not. And the thing is, they need dollars. Their economy runs on dollars. I don't know why the gold pumpers don't tell you this, but they have dollar-denominated debt. They can't just eliminate their dollar position. Oh, they'll just sell all their dollars and buy gold. You know, that would make a great story, wouldn't it, if you're trying to sell gold? But it's not the case. Now, let's get into this. We know that the Chinese economy is based on, we know they have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of real estate projects that are not, they're in disuse or not used at all. And remember, that's a cost. That's not even an asset. If you own real estate, just think of it yourself. If you live in a house, you got to pay property taxes. Well, at least you live there, so you pay the property taxes. But let's say you have a rental property and you don't live there and you don't have a tenant. All right, maybe the place is worth something, but you still have to pay property taxes. But you could say, well, I'll pay the property tax. Eventually, I'll get a tenant. But what if you own an apartment building in the middle of nowhere where no one lives? I don't know if that's really an asset if you have to pay taxes on it, and no one might live there for 10 years or might not ever live there. So the idea that they have all these assets, I'm not quite sure that they do. Now, what they got out of that was workers got paid, they made tax money, they made bank loans, they showed GDP growth. Well, there's a limit to what you can do to your own country. The government knows that they have created many bridges and roads to nowhere. They've got an overbuilding of apartment complexes. Well, let's take that show on the road, and that is my Belt and Road. That's the other thing. China to crush the dollar. They're going to all over the Belt and Road. They're going to run the world. Yeah, okay, well, they do the same thing overseas. They export their road to nowhere economy overseas. We've had many instances about the Belt and Road where countries have gotten hosed by signing up to China's, oh, we'll build you a port, and then they can't pay for it, and then because they default on it, China ends up with a port. They've had instances where the Malaysian government has canceled a couple of very big key Chinese-funded infrastructure projects, and also China is not immune to canceling themselves. Well, here's a story here in Bloomberg. China built a railroad to nowhere in Kenya. Surprise, surprise. Now, when China builds these, it does give, they do export Chinese workers. They get jobs, they create GDP, and then they realize better to build stuff and let it rot overseas than to do that in our own country. So they now have this infrastructure in Kenya that no one can really use, but my Belt and Road and gold back yuan, game changer, China to crush the dollar, end of dollar hegemony, multipolar world. China is going to be this kind of stuff never stops because if there's gold to be sold, the pumpers, they're going to use this Chinese story until it really is laughable. But again, a lot of people, they don't pick up on this. All they do is they binge watch these gold pumper videos, all repeating the same story, and they never hear the other side of it. So, China exporting their economy overseas. Let me just read to you a little bit from this story. And there's many like it. This just happens to be the most recent one out of Kenya. It says Beijing is withholding the $4.9 billion needed to finish the project once the flagship for Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah, well, my Belt and Road, they don't need it anymore, I guess. They realize that debt is debt. So China, this according to Bloomberg, is withholding $4.9 billion needed to finish the project. Now remember, there's also another thing called the Quad. Now this is the United States, Japan, and Australia, and India. They're a consortium that are also doing Belt and Road type funding, but they're not going crazy on it. They're not doing these massive debt schemes. They're trying to be more opportunistic in helping build out infrastructure, not just build it because we need to put a lot of people to work. We need to create some economic activity. Actually has to be a use or a market need for the project. Well, what the Quad aims to do, headed by the United States, is to, in some respects, pick up the pieces where there's a bad Chinese deal or maybe provide bridge financing to the Chinese deal. So the idea that China is just marching across the world, stuffing gold in its pockets and taking over the world by building infrastructure, that is a gold pumper fantasy. They are not any more adept at avoiding debt than anyone else. Their gold penchant notwithstanding. So according to this story, gleaming concrete sleepers run across a new railroad bridge in Kenya, the latest stretch of Chinese-built line from the coast all the way to Uganda. Only it doesn't quite reach the border. It ends abruptly by a sleepy village about 75 miles west of the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, and the tracks lay unused. So there you have it. The amazing thing about all of this is not whether China is better than the U.S. or the U.S. is better than China or China to whatever the battle is, which is really just a fake battle that the gold pumpers, I believe, just make up in order to make it seem like the United States is going to collapse and you better have your bags filled with gold because China is going to be the one to deal the death blow when they roll their gold out into a stadium and say to the United States, "Where's yours?" or some other. I heard that somewhere. And the world doesn't think in terms of gold like that anyway. And I don't think China's going to roll its gold out to a stadium or they're going to collapse the COMEX. All these stories, they're all designed. I guess once you believe, if you have gold front of mind, you can believe it. You think, well, the rest of the world has gold front of mind. That's all they think about. Debt should be denominated in gold. Everything is about gold. And China's all about gold, which it's not. But they'll have you believe that's all China thinks about collectively, individually. People in China wake up in the morning and look to go fill their bags with gold. And they're smart because of that, and they understand gold, and the people in the West are dumb. That whole story. But the point is that what is true on either side of the equation is there is a massive amount of debt out there, and it's not just China, and it's not just the United States. It is a global debt phenomena, global debt Ponzi scheme, and a lot of that debt now is negative interest rates, which is highlighting that the issue with debt is it has to be repaid. And I guess the way you reduce your ability, your debt payments, is you don't promise to pay interest and you actually pay people to take the money. Who knows where all this will end? But my bet is not that the United States collapses under its debt first, because all these countries have borrowed money in dollars, and they need dollars, so the U.S. can continue to supply them dollars by printing them, and in the meantime also self-dealing itself and paying off its debt or funding its projects with debt. It's the emerging market countries and their fiat currencies, which I believe will collapse first. What do you think?